Okay, right at time. So, with that, I'm going to get started. Hi folks, welcome to the Slurm SC21 Birds of a Feather session. I'm Tim Wickberg. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for SchedMD. An overview of our agenda for today for the next hour or so. We're going to go through the Slurm release schedule just as a brief overview, just a refresher as to where we are at in that release schedule and what's upcoming. We'll go through the 2108 release that came out in this August on new features and new functionality that introduced. And then we'll go into the upcoming roadmap for the 2205 and 2302 releases. After that, I have a good amount of time set aside for an open Q&A and open forum with folks that we can discuss stuff related to the roadmap, or if you have any other questions, I'll attempt to field those as best I can, as long as they're kind of relevant to a broader audience. For questions, please ask questions in the Zoom chat. I am not looking at Slido. I don't have it on the screen. I don't know if people have already asked questions over there, but please do ask them here in the chat. I will try to respond to them as I see them if I think they're immediately relevant to what I'm discussing. Otherwise, I may defer some of those questions to the open Q&A at the end. If I don't get to your question as I'm going through the prepared slides up front here, please feel free to re-ask at the end if you think I've missed it. Recording. So the BOFs themselves are not being directly recorded through the SC21 hub site. At least that's what I was most recently told. However, I am locally recording a copy of what I'm saying here, and we will be putting that on the SchedMD YouTube channel, hopefully later this afternoon if everything works out. The slides, you can see Brian Christensen, who's one of our principal developers, put a link to the slides that you're seeing right now. I will also have them linked off of the SchedMD publication site later today. And one last note, SchedMD is hiring. If you're interested in working on Slurm full-time, please feel free to reach out and get in touch with us. And with that, into the release schedule. So, most recent and upcoming Slurm releases. We did 2011 in November 2020. We actually released that during the SC20 BOF. 2108 came out this August. And then the upcoming releases, 2205 are May 2022, and then 23, and there's a typo there, that should be 2302 in February of 2023. I'm going to make a note to go fix that. The release schedule. So the Slurm major releases come out every 9 months. The major release numbers are the 2 digits of the year, a period, and then the 2 digits of the month. So 21.08 is the most recent release in 2021 August. The maintenance releases, such as 2108.1, .4 is actually the most recent at this point, come out roughly monthly. I don't have a fixed cadence for when I release those. They're sort of subject to demand and an accumulation of enough interesting bug fixes to cut a new release. SchedMD officially supports the 2 most recent major releases. So at the moment, that's the 2108 release and the 20.11 release. The 20.02 release is no longer supported. The 2002 release also highlights why we prefer the 20.11 as the version. There is no such thing as a Slurm 20 release. There were actually 2 different releases made in the course of the year 2020. So, with that, on to a review of the Slurm 2108 release. This is going to be kind of a collection of different small features and additions that we've made. There's not a huge amount of organization behind these because it's kind of scattered over a broad range of areas. So just jumping in. The job submission command. We now store that into the accounting database, and that's retrievable through the new -O submit line option to the saccount tool. So if you want to see exactly what your users typed as part of their SBatch submission, that's now captured for you and stored off in the accounting data. As an example, and I'm hoping you can read this, if not, the slides do have a hopefully higher resolution version of this. You can see just an example of me submitting one job here, SBatch wrap sleep 1000 exclusive -N2. And you can kind of see that these are just captured there so you can go refer to them later. Another thing that's been long requested is a way to archive user job scripts so that you can go back and look at what people were doing, capture them even if the user deleted them off the file system or doesn't remember what they submitted. We added this in 2108 with this new accounting store flags option that supports JobScript as well as JobEnv as options. These can be then retrieved later through the saccount tool with batchscript or envars options to go and fetch those back out of the accounting data. I do have to note the 2108.4 release fixed a security issue around the permissions required to access these. Users themselves are the only ones, users themselves and account coordinators and the admins are the only ones meant to be able to see these. Accidentally, we exposed that to a slightly broader audience. So if you're looking at enabling these, please upgrade to that most recent 2108 release. Just as an example here, I do sbatch wrap to submit a trivial toy job here again. And then I just run saccount batch script against the job number, which was 1360, and I get back the batch script that came along with that job submission. Another common request has been around how Slurm views nodes as idle. The idle state has long been sort of misconstrued by users to imply that the node is not doing anything, and that if they submit a job right now, their job should immediately be allowed access to that compute node. That hasn't really been the case for a long time. A node is idle if it is not currently running something, but we may have a plan within the Slurm scheduler for what we are going to do with that compute node in short order, and you may not be able to get immediate access to that compute node. So we introduced this new idea of a planned node state. This implies that the scheduler has a plan for that node. It's not 100% idle. Well, sorry, it is 100% idle right now, but we're going to do something with it. It's not completely idle in perpetuity. We're going to do something with it. You're going to not necessarily have immediate access to that node. So again, it's just a small user interaction change here. You can see here, I've kind of just made a very trivial example with I have jobs sitting in the queue that are waiting for two nodes. I have two nodes in my cluster. One of them is currently in use, but the other one is in an older release marked as idle. And this is where you get your users complaining that I can't get access to that node. In the new 2108 release, we've changed that to planned. The short form of that is PLND here. So it's no longer marked as idle. We do have an expected use for it. A user could still submit a very short running job and potentially have it backfill scheduled right now, but they can't expect to submit a job that needs 5 hours or 5 hours, 5 days on that compute node and get it to run immediately. It's planned to be used in the future. With the auth JWT authentication mechanism, which is principally designed for use with the SlurmScriptd interface, we added support for RS-256 token types. These are specified through what's known as a JWKS file describing the RSA keys that it should work with. And this is configured and set up through this new auth parameter JWKS file, where you need to point to an explicit file. This can be used with the auth JWT plugin alongside the existing HS256 support. This is principally designed for folks that are looking at integrating with other authentication schemes such as AWS Cognito, which is a typo. And to better be able to interact with those and then integrate through the SlurmScriptd, or sorry, through the SlurmRestD in the future. And this is just an example of what one of those JWKS files look like. You're not meant to manually generate these. Whatever you're using to set up and manage your JWKS files should be able to spit this out for you. Some of the other changes we made in the backend to improve support for cgroups in the longer term include a lot of refactoring of the current cgroup code. The cgroup subsystem in Slurm has actually been around for a very long time. As far as I know, Slurm was one of the first major users of the cgroup subsystems. There was a lot of baggage that had kind of accumulated alongside the way we were interacting with it. Internally, we significantly refactored all of this to split the cgroup interactions into their own dedicated infrastructure. So it was consistently used for the task cgroup, proctrack cgroup, and job account gather cgroup plugins, and they were all behaving exactly the same way. The important part of this is it gives us a clearer path to future cgroup v2 support, which I'll get to a little later in this slide deck. I'm going to jump back here and answer a question from Houston Rogers here. Do planned work with large reservations as well? We make a reservation to take nodes X to Y down for maintenance, make a reservation on a specific date, and those should say planned instead of idle. I think somebody can quickly check. Off the top of my head, I can't remember if we factor in reservations yet. If we don't, that's something we could certainly look at fixing. Okay, moving back forward. Burst buffer Lua. So for a long time, we've had support for the burst buffer data warp plugin, which interacts with the Cray data warp subsystem. But we've really wanted to get a generic version of this out there so that you can do your own interesting integrations with other things that aren't data warp. There has been a generic plugin that's been included in Slurm for a while, but it was never fully completed, and it's not something we ever recommended anyone use. Instead, we've actually gone a slightly different direction and finally now have a Lua plugin that is meant as a generic implementation of a burst buffer and lets you provide a Lua script to run within the Slurm controller or the SlurmScriptd and do the burst buffer style interactions, which include sort of asynchronously moving data or job setup around within the controller within the Slurm context. The key part of the burst buffer API is it lets you do things without the compute nodes already being allocated to the compute job and sitting there otherwise idle. This is kind of a key difference as to why you may want to use parts of this versus the Prolog SlurmControlD or Epilog SlurmControlD interfaces. This is happening asynchronously from the job being allocated compute nodes and gives you a lot of power as to how you do some sort of setup and data staging in your own environment. Marshall did a separate presentation at SlurmDBD going into further details as to how you might set up and start building out your own Lua script to interact with something. I'll defer you guys to that for further details. This is actually tangentially related to that burst buffer Lua work, but we introduced this new SlurmScriptd process that runs and accompanies the Slurm controller. As part of our development of the burst buffer Lua plugin, we realized that directly forking and execing scripts or anything within the Slurm controller is extremely expensive for systems that are running higher throughput and higher job counts. This is due to the memory footprint of the Slurm controller growing larger and the amount of time it takes the Linux backend just to copy the associated page tables as it starts up a new process actually grows quite large. Instead of trying to deal with that, we realized that we could set up a separate process that runs directly alongside the Slurm controller that is set up explicitly just to launch scripts on behalf of the Slurm controller. Right now, this interface is only being used for the burst buffer Lua plugin and the Prolog SlurmControlD, Epilog SlurmControlD. But we do expect to expand this in the future, and we've already started seeing some considerable performance benefits from using this with Prolog SlurmControlD and Epilog SlurmControlD. We do expect at some point, especially to use the mail program through this as well, and take a lot of the penalty of running a mail program for your users out of the Slurm controller. Some other cleanup we've done include a lot of fixes to this Job Container tmpfs plugin. Job Container tmpfs is something we actually snuck in to the 2011.5 maintenance release. Since it was a brand new plugin, we were comfortable shipping it because it's not configured by default. Sites had to explicitly turn it on. We're actually quite surprised to see a lot of early adoption of this plugin, but we did find a number of small design issues and changes that we were going to need to support this longer term. Especially making sure that the namespaces that this managed are being properly tracked and handled across restarts of the SlurmD process to make sure that the new job steps that may be launched at a later point in time are set up and managed correctly. So a lot of further refactoring went into the 2108 release to help support this. For the most part, you shouldn't really see any direct changes from this, but a lot more consistent behavior if you are restarting and starting and stopping processes within your compute nodes. One other requested thing, and there's actually been a very long outstanding ticket, was the idea of directly dumping info out of some of the Slurm commands in something that's a lot easier to parse. So saccount, sinfo, and sq have now all adopted the --json and --yaml output options. This is actually using the same underlying serialization and translation code that the slurmscriptd itself uses, but it's directly managed and handled in the command itself. You don't need to set up and manage the slurmscriptd to do this. It is limited just to processing output for certain commands right now. Input in some fashion may be supported at a longer period, but that's not something in the current code. This is just a very trivial example of dumping some output through the saccount command. You can see here saccount --json. I pipe it into the jq command, which is a very convenient tool for sort of slicing and dicing JSON output. And you can see I just truncated the top 14 lines of this output for a toy little example for this slide. But this is available and useful on everything right now. Ben Allen, you're asking, can we now have %0 or %all to stop guessing required fixed field lengths? That's an interesting idea. I don't think I've seen that proposed before. You're welcome to file that as an enhancement request. I can't say that computing... The problem is the way that the current output formats work, that's not actually that simple. We don't know how wide you would want a field to be until we've already output it. If you're looking at using the normal text column output and are trying to parse it, the -p option is a better place to start with than trying to do the fixed widths. And then Harvey, yes, I do see that. That is a request. I do welcome folks to file potential enhancement requests around that if you think that would be of use. I haven't seen that specific request cross my plate yet. Okay, moving on to srun --bcast. So the srun bcast command can be used to send files out through Slurm's internal communication hierarchy. This can be quite important on very large-scale systems with thousands of compute nodes to avoid having a job launch of a specific process cause what's known as a thundering herd problem for your file system, where potentially 2,000 compute nodes simultaneously try to open the same file out of Lustre, out of GPFS, out of wherever, and then the backend file system does not appreciate that many nodes simultaneously trying to open the same file and kind of throws some performance issues your way. Instead, we made srun be able to, when you're using srun to launch a process, the bcast option means we can open and load that file once, fan it out, and then launch a cached copy of that file rather than directly going to the file system. This works great for static binaries, but does not work very well for shared library executables because we'd broadcast the first file and then all of a sudden the Linux's file management has to go and load all the libraries off the shared file system, and that itself can then overwhelm the shared file system in the same way. So this new feature for srun bcast is to go through and actually look for all of the shared libraries that are associated with the executable and send those alongside the executable and then launch those cached copies instead. This is something that's not turned on by default yet. This is turned on site-wide through this bcast parameter sendlibs in slurm.conf. Or there's an explicit srun -bcast -sendlibs you can do to directly turn that on. With all of this shared library resolution, obviously we don't want to find stuff out of the generic system libraries like lib, userlib, so we exclude those from our search path by default. For example, there's no point to sending copies of libc.so to all your compute nodes. If your compute nodes don't have libc, good luck. That sounds kind of broken. So there's this bcast exclude option that lets you tweak that if there's other directories you'd prefer to not have captured and sent alongside this as well. Stuart, you're asking Python jobs with large shared libraries. Python potentially, yes, can be helped. The key part of this is that the shared library resolution has to happen up front. Python, at least in part, if the modules themselves are what are pulling in those libraries, we can't resolve those up front. There are other tools such as Spindle from Livermore that might be of interest for that type of use case, but this can certainly help a little bit. Okay, there's one other question. I'm going to try and tangentially answer it here. Can someone share possible pros and cons for using srun inside sbatch for multi-node jobs? Srun is kind of misunderstood in a lot of places. Srun is designed to make what Slurm calls a job step. This is potentially a subset or even your entire set of compute nodes within your job. But it's designed to give you some flexibility in how processes are started and launched on multiple nodes simultaneously. srun can be used in a lot of cases instead of the MPI exec or MPI run commands to directly do your MPI process setup. It can also be used to partition off certain numbers of compute nodes, certain numbers of GPUs, and slice and dice the resources that your job has been allocated in a lot of different ways. That's as much as I'm going to try and go into here. There's a lot of documentation out there trying to kind of clarify parts of that. Or if folks have other ideas as to how to help answer that question, please feel free to respond in the chat directly there. One other thing we've put into 2108 is this idea of OCI Container Support. This is a way to directly launch processes out of an OCI container, building off of some of the file system namespace work that we've done, for example, alongside the Job Container tmpfs plugin. Nate has a presentation from SlurmDBD that goes into a lot further details on how to set this up and manage it. Another thing in the back end, we did a lot of work to improve job step throughput. So using srun within the job to subdivide your compute nodes in a lot of different ways. We went and cleaned up a lot of older code that was there and significantly improved the throughput for people trying to use srun to launch a lot of smaller tasks through your system. It is also directly kind of complementing other work with this experimental slurmscriptd parameter enable RPC-Q option that we introduced back in 2011. There's also been a lot of work around the idea of power saving and cloud nodes. One of the things we did was to add options to the partitions to control the suspend time, suspend timeout, resume timeout. These options are used to turn on and off compute nodes on demand. That's the basis of our cloud bursting support model. For hybrid systems where you have an on-prem cluster, but do also want to burst out to the cloud, having these be global options is a bit inconvenient. So now we allow these to be set directly on the partition level so that you can set up a partition that's designed to turn those cloud nodes on and off directly, but your normal cluster is otherwise unaffected. We also added this idea of a JSON mapping for the jobs to the nodes for the resume program. The resume program is in cloud bursting what is used to turn on compute nodes. This lets that resume program have a little more insight into what Slurm is trying to use those newly booted nodes for by pointing out exactly which jobs are supposed to be allocated to those when it starts up. So this file is set through this environment variable slurm resume file and can give you further information in your resume program as to what's supposed to be going on. There's one question here I'm going to try and answer. When Slurm is used in GCP, does it support preemptive nodes or have auto scaling up and down of the clusters? Brian Christensen, who's hanging around here, can hopefully answer that in the chat a little bit better. But yes, I believe you can work with either preemptive or non-preemptive nodes. Depends kind of on what your use case is and how you want to run it. And Brian is saying yes. There's also, thank you for dropping that link there. There is an HPC Slurm on GCP code lab that you can go and play around with Google, get a little bit of kind of insight in how to set up and test that. One other thing we added is this idea of an extra field to the compute nodes. This is designed to get used alongside the power saving model for cloud bursting to let you pack some additional metadata about that node into another field that's just tracked and managed alongside that compute node through Slurm and through the scontrol tool. One other thing, and man, I'm running a little bit behind on time, SELinux support for job launches. This is something that's still kind of experimental and is not on by default, but this can be used to capture the SELinux context that a user is running in. Then through a job submit plugin that you need to write yourself for your site and run within the Slurm controller, you can validate that that context makes sense for that user's job to have access to. And then if you set it through that job submit plugin, the SELinux context will be established before we launch processes for that user on the compute node. So ideally, with this setup tuned and set up correctly for your site, you can have a user in a specific context and make sure that the jobs they launch land in that same context out on the compute nodes, generally due to some sort of compliance handling for your systems. Again, this is disabled by default. This has to be turned on at build time through enable SELinux. It does not compile in by default. SELinux obviously needs to be available on the compute nodes. It's not actually needed to be enabled on the Slurm controller hosts. And then the key part of this is you do need to write a job submit plugin to validate what SELinux context the user is supposed to be able to have access to and run under. We cannot do that directly ourselves. Mostly through a limitation in how the munge credential handling works today. Okay, that is the 2108 release. Before I move on, does anyone have any further questions related to Slurm 2108? Okay, jumping straight into the 2205 roadmap. If you were watching my presentation from the Slurm user group meeting, I'll say that this has been flushed out considerably. We've gotten a lot of sort of contractual details nailed down. This has been quite expanded over what I presented there. To start off, we're adding this idea of a preferred node constraint. So this is a list of optional or soft constraints that should be considered when selecting compute nodes for the job to run on. It's going to use the -- prefer option to sbatch, SELinux, and srun. And then when Slurm goes to schedule and launch the job on these nodes, it will look through the compute nodes. It'll take these additional filters and attempt to find a compute node that matches these. If it can't immediately find it, we will fall back to just the traditional list of hard constraints, the -- constraint option, and use those instead. So this is a way to help your users steer jobs to nodes they would rather be on, but doesn't otherwise block their job from launching immediately. I hinted at this earlier, but one thing that we will be doing in Slurm 2205 is getting support for cgroups v2. At the moment, only cgroup v1 support's enabled. We have noticed a lot of Linux distributions are now turning off the legacy cgroup v1 support that Slurm currently relies on. So this is obviously catching up and making sure that we support future distributions as they get released. Backfill scheduling support for licenses. This is kind of a subtle internal that surprisingly not many people have caught on to before, but the licenses that a job requests are currently ignored by Slurm's backfill scheduling implementation. What this means is that if a job is requesting licenses and those licenses aren't currently available, when we go to plan out the future use of the cluster, that job is skipped over entirely. Obviously, for jobs that require licenses, this is far from ideal. And can lead to starvation of that job. That job may never run if those licenses are hotly contested. So for 2205, we are going to go and fix this. We're going to add proper support in the backfill scheduler to make sure we plan out the future usage of those licenses and that we don't skip over those jobs that are otherwise blocked waiting for licenses to become available. We also have this idea of GPU sharding. This is to allow for users that can cooperate and share a GPU on a compute node to have Slurm break up that GPU into a number of shards and then ask for a certain number of those shards as part of their job. There is no sort of software or hardware enforcement behind these. This is only for use with processes that know how to cooperate together. But it does let you break up that GPU GRES in Slurm into a number of different elements and allow for Slurm to still manage the CUDA visible devices environment variables correctly, for example. The major caveat here is there's no hardware enforcement behind this. This is just a virtual layer over the top of your existing GPUs. For most sites, you may be more interested in enabling something like NVIDIA's MIG mode on some of their newer devices. One new plugin that's coming in is an AcctGatherinterconnect plugin for folks that want to track and have Slurm catalog network statistics. We'll be adding support to grab those statistics from both the OmniPath and the HPE Slingshot interconnects with the next release. One thing with the LLN support, this is an option that's existed in Slurm for a long time. LLN stands for least loaded node. And this is an option that you can enable either globally or on a specific partition, and it inverts Slurm's default scheduling behavior. By default, Slurm packs jobs into as few compute nodes as it can get away with. The theory behind this is Slurm is always optimizing for big compute jobs that may be coming down the pipeline in the future and tries to keep as many nodes available as possible. LLN inverts this behavior and tries to spread the workload out through your entire cluster by default. The caveat here is Slurm's existing definition of how LLN is established is just based on which nodes still have more cores available. It doesn't really pay attention to how busy the node is. It's just using the number of available cores as a proxy for how available the node is. This works fine in a homogeneous environment where you have the same core count across all of your compute nodes. This does not work great in a more heterogeneous environment where you may have a node with 128 cores and a lot of other compute nodes with 32 cores. That 128 core count node may end up seeing almost your entire cluster's workload up until it actually spreads out to some of those other 32 core count ones. Because until the 128 node filled up 96 of its cores, it still always has the most available cores. So with the 2205 release, we're going to be redefining LLN as the proportion of allocated cores in the node to total cores. This sort of matches up with a more established definition of what least loaded should really mean in your cluster. For most systems, we don't expect a major change in behavior from this, but if you do have those more heterogeneous environments, this should hopefully match your expectations a little bit better from what should happen by turning this flag on. Slurm's accounting system. We're going to add a new option to the SlurmDBD to allow operation without the default account being set on every user account. Right now, Slurm's accounting system forces you to always maintain a default account for every user. By default, we want that to be set up so that when a user submits a job, they don't have to always specify an account with it. Slurm will just always put them in the default. So the SAccount Manager tool and the Slurm database enforce that a user always has this set. This can cause problems if you're automating and scripting around the SAccount Manager command line to manage your user addition and removal elsewhere. It's a bit more flexible if Slurm doesn't enforce this restriction and instead lets your other accounting tools that you're integrating with kind of manage these defaults for you. So this will be a new option you can turn on if you want to disable that sort of sanity check and run without it, and especially require your users to specify accounts as part of their job submissions. Okay, that's it for 2205. Moving forward even further into 2302. One thing that's always been a pain point in Slurm is that the node definitions within your cluster matter a lot. If you've ever tried to change your node definitions around but haven't restarted everything in your cluster, the slurmds and the slurm controller, you've probably noticed that things will get out of sync and stuff won't quite behave right. Today you must restart the slurmd processes alongside the slurm controller if you change those node definitions. Going forward, this is obviously a pain point, especially with more flexible environments. So we're going to support truly dynamic nodes, where you can add and remove compute nodes from the cluster without all this overhead of restarting the slurmd process throughout the entire system. This also helps us move away from the current sort of kludge of how the future node definitions work in Slurm to support the cloud bursting model. We'll have better ways to support this going forward. We are doing a lot of the underpinning work in the 2205 release, but the truly dynamic nodes won't really be available until 2302. And I have a question here, would this include changes like node memory? Yes, this would help with changes to the compute nodes of any sort, to move away from them being rather statically defined like they are today. License management. We've seen a lot more sites care a lot about integrating with their license managers. The way that we recommend doing this today is through remote licenses that are defined through saccount manager and managed by the SlurmDBD. We've noticed a number of kind of quirks with the way that we built this. One of the things is that you have to specify proportions of the license to hand to different clusters as a percentage. It turns out pretty much every sysadmin I've talked to doesn't really think of their licenses as percentages. They think of absolute counts that they'd want to assign to one cluster or the other. So we're going to change this to allow you to do it by explicit license count. We are also, and I'm missing a slide, we're also going to be adding some capabilities around tracking the currently used number of licenses, which is something that you can easily pull and get out of the lmstat utility in FlexLM, for example. By allowing you to specify and keep that value updated, we can then have the Slurm scheduler base its decisions on how to track and manage the rest of the licenses in your system off of that value, rather than having you try to change the available license count dynamically. Related to these licenses is this idea of preempting for licenses. Today, the licenses are not considered a preemptible entity. So on a license by license basis, you'll be able to specify that that license is eligible to be preempted. And Slurm will be able to preempt jobs that are occupying those licenses to be able to accumulate enough licenses to start a higher priority job. And then kind of one note on the slide here, especially if you're using licenses in Slurm, not just to manage software licenses, but instead to manage sort of other system resources, this is kind of where this especially becomes more important. A license in Slurm is a lot more flexible than just a software license. A license in Slurm is really just a resource that's not tied into a specific compute node in the cluster. So we've seen sites that use these licenses to manage scratch file system space, to manage network bandwidth, and access to a lot of other different types of affiliated equipment that aren't directly attached to a compute node. I'm trying to read through a question here. Is there an option plan to optimize Slurm for response time rather than max throughput to minimize the job start wait times for small users? There are different ways with the current scheduler parameters options, especially to better tune for this. A lot of that comes down to site-by-site customization and configuration. That's something our support team helps sites out with a lot. By default, it's not really tuned to do that. As you note, by default, it's kind of a different setup, gearing more towards max system throughput. But there are ways to adjust Slurm to behave that way today. Okay, with that, and only a few minutes off of my projected schedule, I'm done with all the roadmaps, and this is the open Q&A block. So this is designed as a open forum for the Slurm community to kind of ask questions, get feedback, or trade any other things they may want. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat here and respond and pick out some stuff. One question here. Do we plan any means of expressing some form of topology in the allocation request? That a job wants 10 128 nodes with each groups of 128 nodes strictly closely connected. Would benefit from topology awareness. I'd be interested in understanding the use case a little bit better. We have had a lot of requests recently related to how Slurm's topology support works and ways to extend and manage that. I don't have any immediate plans to change and revise that. Some of what you're requesting can be kind of managed through the constraint subsystem today, but not exactly what you're going for with that specific use case you've outlined. It's certainly a place that we can improve, but it's also something that's not simple to do generically, and I don't want to build a solution just for one use case. I'm going to move to, let's see, a question about Slurm reservations. I used to use Torque PBS, and after I made reservations certain nodes for some users didn't have to request the reservations, and their job would preferentially run on the reserved nodes. But if they were full, they would spill over to the other non-reserved nodes. There is actually something we introduced in Slurm that handles this for users. It's called a magnetic reservation. It actually originally was known as a promiscuous reservation before folks pointed out that that was a really poor choice of terminology on our part. We corrected it to magnetic. So if you turn the magnetic flag on those reservations, the user doesn't have to specify them. If the reservation has available resources and their job is eligible to run in that reservation, it will automatically launch in that reservation for you. I'm going to use this as one tangent since you're typing Slurm out in all caps. We actually made the decision back in 2012 to stop referring to Slurm as an acronym, and we prefer just Slurm with a capital S, lowercase lurm. And we've tried to shy people away from typing it in shouty caps. The Slurm acronym originally stood for Simple Linux Utility for Resource Management. We've kind of shied away from that because Slurm has gotten a lot more sophisticated than simple. And we also not only do the resource management on the compute nodes, we also do job scheduling for the cluster as well as federation across clusters. So we kind of moved away and deprecated the acronym and moved to our preferred typing that you're seeing in a lot of the other comments here. How do I Troy, how do you foresee Slurm being used with composable systems like Liquid or Giga.io? We're happy to see interesting and sort of novel uses there. I have not looked too far into there, into other ways that we can maybe interact there. I would say one of the big things that would help in a lot of those fronts is the work around truly dynamic nodes in Slurm. If we can get there, that helps with a lot of this sort of composable style architecture. Carlos, are there any plans to offer something other than Munge for authentication, which requires placing cluster-wide secrets on user-accessible compute nodes? Nothing I can talk about right now. Right now, we do require Munge throughout the cluster, and you do need to have that set up. The auth JWT that we introduced is sort of a step in the direction of having other things, but it's not designed as a replacement for auth Munge within the cluster today. Yosef, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right. What about support for recent PMIX versions 4 and upcoming 5? We are working on support for the newer PMIX versions. We work closely with the PMIX developers on that. But we've had a few tickets stuck in the review queue for a little while, trying to sort out some underlying complications with where their code is currently at and where it's going. I believe we should have PMIX 4 support sorted out shortly. I'm not going to promise that it's going to happen in the 2108 release. I'm pretty sure we're holding that to 2205. And then upcoming 5X will support once we get 5X out there. Paul, one example of topology where I'm not going to load that right now, but thank you for the link. I'll try and take a look at that later. Ryan, sophisticated also starts with S. It's almost like I knew that when I went with sophisticated. Thanks, Ryan. Would it make sense to unify some of the flags? Node list is -w and SQ, but -n in S account. I'll say one of the challenges of sort of overseeing the roadmap for a product as long-lived as Slurm is that there are a number of early decisions, especially with our CLI API, that do kind of haunt us in the longer term. Especially some of the flag options, some of the way the flags are processed don't quite work the way we would prefer they would if we started over. But at the same time, we can't easily redefine or rechange those flags because so many people rely on them in their own scripting and their own pipelines. So unfortunately, no, we're not going to change the way like -w or -n for node list are working across the user commands. Thank you for that use case there around topology with trying to sort of lock different parts of your process into sort of different switch models. I would say one thing that you can kind of do to steer that is to use the existing topology support, but it doesn't really come to supporting that specific use case today. For system testing, it's very annoying. You can't do something like -x with specific node ranges if it's not in the state Slurm wants. Is there a way to change that? I think we made some changes around how that's processed going into 2205, but I was not the one that reviewed that ticket. If you have some more sort of specific use cases around there might be something that we can do to improve that. You're always welcome to support that, to submit an enhancement request, which we may be able to look at some point. Okay, I think I'm caught up to the tail end of the questions people have asked so far. We have another 10 minutes or so left here. If folks have other questions, I'm happy to continue chatting for a bit. Or if folks have run out of questions they want, I'm also certainly happy to wrap up and let people get back to their days a few minutes early. Give people another 30 seconds to get any last minute questions here. Otherwise, I'll move to wrap up. Currently, the constraint supports and or. Can we have a not? That's. I'm trying to remember in the constraint model why we don't have a not. I think it'd be an interesting enhancement request if some site wanted to sponsor some work going into that. That's something we could certainly look at doing. If I remember right, I think I've looked at this before and it's not quite as easy to implement with the range of other support or operators that we currently have. I'd also caution that we probably wouldn't use the exclamation point since the exclamation point on the shell is already doing some other things for you. Charles, I assume it is unreasonable for Slurm to support fully unbuffered writing of batch job standard out, standard error. I would take a look. I don't have the option in front of me, but there are ways to change how the buffering works. There is a flag to let you disable some of the buffering. There's also a way to flip the PTY pseudo terminal support on and off there. The output in Slurm is always going to get redirected over part of the network. It's never going to be instantaneous, just due to how we very early on chose to architect the I/O handling. But there are flag options to change a little bit of how that's handled. I'd look at the sbatch man page, and I'm blanking on what the option name to look for is. Alexander, is there a plan to add searching the interpreter scripts for shared object libraries they load for the bcast feature later? I do not plan to do that because it's going to vary too much based on each each interpreter. There's not a consistent way for us to try and establish what shared libraries they might want. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but Spindle is a project from Livermore that actually tries to detect shared library loads at runtime and then have a central coordinating process broadcast those files over. I'd encourage you to take a look at that as a potential option for sort of Python style requests. Ryan, any process on licensing, becoming aware of licenses and used on shared license servers? So if I walk back a little bit, these, shrink myself back down in the corner. Some of the stuff that we're planning on working on here should make it easier. We're not planning to have Slurm itself directly query the license server. There's no central API that we can use there. But we do want to make it easier for you to build scripts using our saccount manager tool and the lmstack command, for example, to have you update the currently used license count in Slurm and then have that feedback into our scheduling decisions. So that's a lot of what this is meant to try and simplify. As part of that, we may start publishing some example scripts for use with FlexLM, for example. But we're not planning to build that support directly in there. I am also now really curious as to, is Slurm actually auto-correcting to capitals in Zoom? That would be weird. Okay. When are constraints satisfied in the current Slurm versions? In the past, you caused massive bubbles in job schedulers because constraints were not checked as per conditions, but at a later stage after getting nodes. Slurm is respecting the constraints when it looks to assign nodes to the job. So you can't, the model where you assign the nodes and then retroactively figure out if the constraints match, that is not how Slurm does it. That sounds problematic, as you're presumably seeing. Let's see. David, power control and monitoring stuff seems weak and mostly Cray-based. Any new work being done there? We haven't really done any work in the power space. There's a lot of other thoughts that aren't appropriate for here that I have. If you have systems where that's of interest, there are certainly some people doing some research around different ways to sort of factor that into job scheduling decisions. But we haven't really moved any of that into core Slurm, and I don't have any immediate plans to do so. Is there a way to easily query the number of free cores to get the node with the most free cores? There are people that have scripts that can do that. There's not a direct output from one of the Slurm commands that can handle that. Ryan, probably because, well, please change how you're typing it, Ryan. I'll let you fix that on yourself. Following on to the topology awareness, feasible to squeeze topology aware problems into a heterogeneous job launch with constraints. I would not recommend that. I don't think it will behave quite the way you want. It's a bit more of an advanced use case. You might get the individual components to preferentially land. I do think it would be better if you can decompose the job into either a job array or just multiple individual jobs, each that you're trying to constrain to those specific parts of the switch topology. If you did it that way, you could constrain each of the jobs maybe with the constraint operators and with some judiciously placed features on the compute nodes. Charles, PTY sets unbuffered, which helps, but we'll never see car-by-car output. Correct. There is always a little bit of internal buffering. It's not designed to try and relay character by character, especially because the I/O is being piped over the network. We don't want to send individual packets per byte. I'm curious as to what the use case is for that application that has to care that much about character by character output, but yes, unfortunately we don't do that. I don't have an immediate plan to change that part of the I/O handling. Okay, now we're really coming up on time. I'll give people another, say, 30 seconds or so if you have any last minute questions. Otherwise, I'll move to close up here. Thomas, another scheduler I've used had the option to cache job state data, so things like SQ, I'm going to assume that things like SQ can behave a little faster. We have a lot of different performance work that we've been doing. 2205 should have some further work around stuff like SQ. We've talked about doing some caching, but so far we've found ways to kind of work around the idea of needing to cache anything. There's kind of other approaches we're taking before we resort to caching that data. But interesting question, and thank you for pointing that out. Okay, with that, I'm going to move to wrap things up. Thank you guys all for participating here today. 114 participants as I close off here is certainly better attendance than I'd expected, especially in the slightly weird hybrid environment for SC this year. We do hope to be back with an in-person BOF next year at SC22. We do certainly appreciate all the feedback and support from you guys in the broader community. And I do want to thank you guys all for participating today. So thank you and have a good rest of your afternoon, morning, or whatever time zone you guys are floating around in. Thanks, guys.